morning. Hi, my name is Kelly Nettle. I'm the Clinical Informatics Committee Chair, and I'm part of the HIMSS Washington Board as well. We started the Clinical Informatics Committee in January, and we have this amazing team of clinical informatics. And so I want to share that it's not nursing informatics, it's clinical informatics. So if you work in healthcare, you work in technology, and you're providing value where you're connecting everything and you're making clinicians' lives easier, you can be part of the Clinical Informatics Committee. So I just want to welcome you. This is our first event for the National Health Information Technology Week. Tonight we start off, and then tomorrow we have another event down at Bell Harbor that starts from 1 to 7. Doors open at 12. And it's called the Innovation Summit, so if you want, please come down and enjoy that too. I want to talk to you about our sponsors, and our sponsors are actually here. Engage is one of the largest Meditech partners that do full IT services, implementations. They have implementations teams. They travel all around the United States. They've been going for about 20 years. Stacy and Crystal, if you want to stand up and wave. They're all the way from Spokane, and I used to work with them, so I had a lot of fun when I worked with them. They're a great team to work with. Also, Cambia Grove, I want to thank you for hosting us. They are amazing. I'm going to let Nick talk about Cambia Grove because I can't do you justice. The amazing innovations that they're doing is just, it's amazing. So we have, tonight I want to tell you, we have 3 great panelists. Thank you all for coming. We had 4, but one of the 4, Andrew, was sick, so he wasn't able to show up tonight.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Nick Jackal, and I have the privilege of serving as the Community Relations Manager here at Cambia Grove. How many folks have been to Cambia Grove in the past? I see a lot of familiar faces. Wonderful. Then a lot of new faces as well, too. Welcome, and welcome back, everyone. As you might know, Cambia Grove, we're kind of a unique entity. We are a health innovation hub, obviously here in downtown Seattle, and we focus on bringing together communities much like this to talk about the complexity of healthcare. As you all know, there's a lot of opportunity to talk about that complexity. There's a lot of then responsibility to figure out innovative ways of bringing solutions to complex problems. So we'll talk a little bit more about that throughout our program, and at the end I want to plug a few opportunities for you all to join us and continue this conversation that we'll have here today, but we couldn't be more honored to be the host for this evening and welcome this wonderful panel. I'll turn it over to our panel in a moment to do introductions. We had the opportunity to connect in the boardroom a few moments ago. We touched on Chris Rock, we touched on telephones and had a lot of fun, so we'll maybe bring some of that back up in this conversation here too. With that, I will turn it over to, let's start with you, Kelly. So just a quick introduction.
Hi, I'm Kelly Summers. I'm the Chief Nursing Informatics Officer for University of Washington Medicine here in Seattle. I have been in lovely Seattle a whopping 4.5 months now, so new to Seattle, come from a large health system based out of Phoenix. So thrilled to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
Hi, I'm Yuli Hardy. I'm the Director of Digital Health Innovation at Seattle Children's.
Hi, everybody. I'm Janet Lawless. I work for Center for Threat Intelligence. I'm the CEO and founder. So as far as informatics, we'll learn more from our other guests. And I'll be talking to you more about threat intelligence.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Well, to help kind of set the stage, I'll just read a quick statement to kind of ground us. We live in a technologically filled world. It is all around us. We're in an Amazon building right here. It's literally right on top of us. Healthcare technology is rapidly growing. The HIMSS Washington Clinical Informatics Committee represents a diverse group of professionals, clinicians, IT, health informatic management students, and others within the clinical informatics industry, bridging the gap between healthcare and technology. This event will feature speakers discussing their roles in bridging that gap and their journeys in their careers. We're in the right meeting? Good, okay. Well, with that, let us begin. As we know, in healthcare, there are a lot of buzzwords. There's precision medicine, blockchain, which has kind of fallen out of vogue. I haven't heard it as much this year, but no doubt it still is out there. AI, informatics often gets looped into that. It obviously has a lot more grounding, but for many, me included, and maybe Janet as well, it is not a well-known field or very defined. In order to kind of ground us and have a common definition, Kelly, I'll start with you. How would you define clinical informatics, and what do you think it is?
Sure. So I kind of came to this space by a very varied past. But my definition of informatics, at least, and I primarily have been focusing in the nursing and physician space, but generally speaking, informatics is really those internal consultants to the organization to learn how to leverage the technology that we have to meet the business and clinical needs within the organization. And that can be anything from a non-tech solution around processes and the manner in which we do business, all the way through truly innovative, developing high-tech solutions, and the entire gamut. Additionally, a big piece for me in informatics is the use of data to derive decisions and to improve care. So it's really functioning in that space of clinical process improvement, business analytics, internal consultation to meet the business needs. My experience is we buy lots of technology. Oh, it's not in my pocket right now, including things like an iPhone, and we barely scratch the surface of what those tools are capable of doing. And so we're those internal consultants to make sure that we're getting the maximum benefit of the tools that we've implemented while keeping an eye on what we need to do for our patients and our business.
I actually Googled it before I came. And it was quite boring, I have to say, the way informatics is described. And so I took a step back and thought, what is informatics, and when did it actually get born? And it actually got born out of a time where informatics and your use of data was optional in the way that we see it today, right? It was born out of the 70s and 80s as databases started to come online, and our clinical team started to reimagine the way they could use this data at their fingertips to change the way healthcare was being delivered. And now, with the advent of Moore's Law being where it is, an iPhone in your pocket or a mobile device in your pocket, and the internet being as ubiquitous as it is, and compute power being limitless, it's no longer an option. You can't opt out of informatics. It's you have to opt in or you're irrelevant. And so informatics, I feel like the definition of it is a little bit antiquated, because without our informaticists, we really struggle to bridge all of the opportunity with the reality of how we execute on our care and how we also evolve. I think the thing that I've been most impressed with, Carol Shade, I see her in the audience, who's a real informaticist as opposed to myself. Rod Tarago, Mark Lowe, Jeff Foti, all physician and nurse informaticists in our organization. They're really change agents at the core of it. And without our informaticists, we would have a hard time translating the potential opportunity of what we can do in a digital space and apply that to be able to ensure that we continue to provide our patients and families with the best care possible. And that best care target is a moving target because of where we are in this place and time. There's a book whose title I can't remember. Oh, Thank You for Being Late, by Thomas More, who actually talks about, he uses a word called dynamic stability, and how in the age of information, you can't make decisions based off rules and policies anymore. There's data coming at you all of the time. And so how do you synthesize all of that data into meaningful information in which you can make decisions? And at the core, that's what I see our informaticists doing on a day-to-day basis, taking all of this data and figuring out at the intersection of that clinician's workflow, how do we make the most out of the information that we have so that we can impact care effectively?
So Janet, we'll kick it over to you, and I want to tee you up slightly, and it sounds like informatics is just fundamental to patient-centered care, probably to financially sustainable care, just so essential. So there's a lot of promise, there's a lot of opportunity, not to tee you up to be Debbie Downer, but what are some of the drawbacks, or what are some of the guardrails you might consider as we explore this topic?
So first, I've been in information technology for a long time. since dinosaurs ruled the earth. But that's beside the point. So in IT, we always talk about people, process, and technology. And that's really what informatics is to me. So first that. And I do have to say, about a week ago, I was getting prepared to come and speak at this, and I saw Kelly, and I said, hey, really looking forward to what we're going to talk about. By the way, what is that? So I read a lot about it online, and I watched all the videos, and I'm absolutely not the expert. So, not to be Debbie Downer, but when I was looking at all the videos and reading all the white papers on this, I looked at it and I said, wow, this is absolutely awesome. And this is absolutely, if I was a criminal, this is where I would go to get all my information to attack people. Because the more information that we put about people, processes, and technology is the more information that your adversaries are going to focus on. And when I say adversaries, I mean the bad guys. And it doesn't matter if it's nation states, so if you are doing some informatics on like biochemistry or pharmaceuticals or clinical trials, those types of things, it may be a nation state. And nation states are like China, Russia, North Korea, those kind of, we're a nation state also, but we're not the bad guys, hopefully. But so we're looking at, all of those things that the adversaries may be focused on. It could be the credit cards, as you well know. It could be criminal groups. So while informatics is awesome, and it's all this wonderful data, and it's information rich, we also have to realize that it's a huge security risk, and we have to make sure that we're looking at those things as well to make sure that all of that wonderful data is secure.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's a really useful sort of guardrail and context to set here, right? There's so much potential in healthcare when you think of those buzzier terms. What are the outer limits of those buzzwords? So we can really think about the potential and how to move innovation forward. Shifting gears a little bit, I would love to dive into your personal stories a bit, and if you can kind of describe through an informatics lens, if you can, how you've ended up in your position today and how informatics played a role in that.
So I'm a nurse by background. Oncology and critical care is my primary area. I got really interested in evidence-based medicine, and I'm really, really old. When we were doing order sets on paper, and we were all writing the same CHF order set, and still couldn't get our docs to, do what they needed to do, or give an aspirin in the ED. And as I was doing that work, focused on clinical outcomes, I had the opportunity to bring in a database sort of evidence-based management system, and realized all I had to put in it was claims data. But what I also realized is there's a wealth of information in claims data. We were able to do some major improvements just using the claims data, but we could have done so much more had we had true clinical data in the system. And those of you who are old like me, I know there's a few of you in the room. I see you. I see you there. We all have the same blonde hair. Our standard was pull 30 charts. Review 30 charts, it'll give you an idea of the direction you're headed, and we'll change our care based on that. I don't know that was really statistically accurate in any given case, and depending on how we pulled the charts. And I got frustrated that I didn't have access to the data. So rather than bemoaning the fact that I didn't have access to good data, I turned to look to see how can we help solve that problem. And for me at the time, that was implementing electronic medical records. So I very innocently applied for a job called a critical care domain expert. I had no idea what I was really applying for. It ended up being the ICU specialist for implementing, in that case we were using Cerner, in a large healthcare system. We had 40 hospitals. And that was really my first introduction, the combination of that clinical outcomes management and a consultant who said, you should look into informatics. I went to Info what? So I did a 3-week Winnie, for those of you who are way old like me, the original informatics weekend immersion programs, and said, that's it. It's a combination of my clinical care, my clinical process, my policy development, and my just rabid desire for data to drive care. So I did that, was on a corporate implementation team for almost 12 years and worked my way up through the ranks of that, was our first enterprise clinical informaticist, first clinical informatics architecture, whatever, all kinds of names that they gave me over the years. and then did a pivot about 3 years ago into the digital space. So I kind of explained it to my colleagues of I spent a good amount of time working with physicians and nurses and clinicians, and I did a 180 and said, those guys are behind me, and it's the patients and the consumers that we were focused on. So I spent 3 years in the digital space working with some innovative clients, building some things ourselves to really put tools in the hands of patients and consumers to improve their care. Along that line, have gotten a couple of degrees, just finishing up my doctorate in nursing informatics, and decided now was the time to either leap into that executive role or not. So this opportunity presented itself in beautiful Pacific Northwest, which got me out of the desert that was, 110 degrees. It was just a week or so ago. So I've really come at it from a nursing and a clinical quality perspective, traveling a path that a lot of us, I think, in nursing informatics have followed. Just had some great opportunities. My advice to anyone is keep yourself open to the potential and the opportunities that are there. A long time ago, I set aside what the title was that I was going after, and I looked for the experiences that aligned with my values, with my interest, with my capabilities. And I've been able to do things and been places that I, quite frankly, 33 years ago when I graduated from nursing school, did not even know existed. And in some of cases, they didn't exist. I am pre-internet, basically, so.
Thank you, and what a gain for Washington State. Welcome. Yuli, how did you end up here today?
So we could go way back, or I could give you the abbreviated version. I was just reflecting on when I went back to school the second time, it was in health information and informatics. And I have to be honest, I didn't really know what that was. It just was sort of opportunistic because it was at night. I wanted to go back to school. I wanted to do a flip in my career, and the counselor at UW was like, oh, what about this? And I was like, oh, yeah, sounds good. So I showed up, and I think even when I graduated, I was a little bit like, I'm not really sure what I'm supposed to be doing. So I consulted with our our professors, and said, okay, so I really suck at coding, medical billing coding. I don't see myself in that field. Privacy makes sense to me, but how on earth is it that you need an entire medical records department to manage paper in a hospital? Like, how does that make any sense? And so she said, well, you should check out Children's. There's an opening there for a clinical documentation improvement. I think that was the title. No, clinical documentation integrity specialist. It was actually, we had just put in CPOE, and we needed to monitor. No, we didn't just put it in. I think the 48-hour, you have to sign your orders within 48 hours rule went into effect. And Children's didn't quite know how to manage that. And so my sole job was to develop reports and create like a penalty system for how to get providers to do that. And so the other opportunity was a privacy analyst over at Group Health at the time. And so I entered into the field, and I just found it so fascinating, got immersed into sort of how a hospital operates. I ended up becoming the chair of forms committee, which I thought, my God, there's a forms committee. And so we were still microfilming at the time. I couldn't believe it. We had researchers who would come down and read the microfilm, and we were spending a lot of money to have our records microfilmed and then stored off-site and then retrieved. And so I accidentally ended up pitching scanning, and I said, I know we thought we'd be fully electronic by this time, but we're not yet, so can we just scan this stuff, because we're spending a ton of money, the same amount of money that it would cost to scan it. So through that, learned a ton about like folder structures and discrete data and non-discrete data and the trials and tribulations about how hard it is to actually get people to direct enter things versus dictate things, and became really fascinating. And as we tried to mine data, how difficult it was, because garbage in is garbage out. And I learned so much through our informatics physicians and nurses as they walked me through how workflow impacts data and then outcomes and outputs. I did end up becoming the director of coding because ICD-10 arrived, and that was an eye-opener. I would go to all of the physician meetings at like 7 in the morning and talk about ICD-10, which nobody wanted. And so it was so fun to talk to a bunch of orthopedic surgeons about ICD-10 and the limitless possibilities of documentation there. And I learned even more about data within our systems to, sort of a parallel in your world around just how fascinating it is that there is a department of people who scour through your records and then assign codes to the diagnoses that you place. And then they also have all these rules around, for some of the rule out disorders, what you can and can't code and how that impacts not just billing, but even the severity that's expected around patient outcomes and quality. And then we ended up having clinical standard work teams come and meet with me to say, now, why do you code it this way this time and not this way that time? And don't you know it impacts this and that? And so it became this eye-opening insight into like, wow, we have a long way to go. And yet, there are systems and opportunities around automated workflow that would make us far more efficient, that could gain us some insights. And then I found myself in the world of population health and accountable care. Again, we were scouring claims data to try to find out about medication adherence and fill rates and opportunities around gaps in care. And so now we're in the midst of an EHR migration, which is awesome. And again, it's been so eye-opening to watch our informaticists do what they do in the space of understanding, again, the intersection of workflow. And I think the thing that I talked to Dr. Mark Lowe, one of our informaticists, before the session, and he really talked about how important it is for informaticists to not make assumptions about what we can deliver based on what a system says they can or can't provide without first really understanding the nuances of a clinical team's workflow and that patient workflow and how to make the data, the workflow again, and all of that sort of meld together in sort of, the synergistic way. So I also manage the telehealth team, and so partner closely with our informatics docs and nurses to really understand how to make that all work. So I don't think there's any corner of my world where our informaticists don't play a huge role. We ended up developing an HIE, and our clinical informaticists, our CNIO at the time, really drove us to pragmatic solutioning around, even as we designed the solutions, we sat down with primary care docs as well as informaticists to really begin to observe how do you actually use the data, what's meaningful, what's not in a snapshot in time, what makes sense. And you start to discover it's a really small sliver of data that our clinicians actually end up consuming to make really important decisions. So how do you bring that front and center? So I could go on and on, but that's how I ended up here.
Thank you. Janet, what do you think? How did you end up here, and what are your early thoughts here on what's been shared?
Well, first, I think it's amazing that we all do have something in common, and that is we all started out doing something else, and here we are. I have a master's degree in education. What? And I taught learning handicapped children in San Diego, 4th, 5th, and 6th grade. And it was in the ghetto. And if you don't think San Diego has a ghetto, they do. So I was dealing with children that were bringing in switchblades and all sorts of really fun weapons. So I had a collection at one point. So how do you go from being a teacher in San Diego to an owner of a threat intelligence company? So I went into selling some of the hardware and software that you guys probably use today. I worked at Microsoft. I'll just zip forward. Worked at Microsoft. I did software asset management, which is basically kind of security, telling people to what they needed to upgrade and vulnerabilities. I went to Cisco, where I did software asset management. So did that. Went and worked for a startup company that basically did security, managed security services, and learned a lot about security and the bad guys. And then I left that company, and some of I thought, what do I really want to do when I grow up? I mean, seriously, my last name is Lawless, right? And I didn't think it would be good to be a criminal. So I was talking to some friends, and these are my threat intelligence friends, and people say, how do you have threat intelligence friends? And I really don't know, but as you might imagine, I network a lot and I talk to a lot of people. So they said, why don't you start a threat intelligence company? And I said, sure. And I said, what are we going to do? And they said, well, we'll do training. I said, okay. And they said, in our companies that we already work for, we don't have enough intelligence analysts. And unless they're coming out of the military or retiring, we can't hire anybody. We don't have them. And I said, okay. I said, I can do that. I said, what else are we going to do? And he said, we'll do consulting, and we'll do maturity models. And I said, great. And then I thought about it. And I said, who's going to do it? And they said, well, we will, because it's that important. So I said, well, let me just go ahead and ask some people. And so I ended up finding some wonderful advisors. So they were acquaintances of mine. And these guys are from the NSA, CIA, FBI, name an acronym. And these guys are awesome, right? So I thought, I better go ask them if they think this is a good idea. So I went and had coffee with some people. And I said, so I'm thinking about doing this. And by the time I had talked about it for about 10 minutes, these wonderful, amazing people with this incredible experience were offering to be my advisors. And I was like, well, the reason we're here is I was going to ask you to be an advisor, but could you please wait until I ask? Because I really wanted to ask. And they said, sure. I said, will you be an advisor? They're like, sure. So it ended up that more and more people that are actually in this industry of threat intelligence that have intelligence backgrounds just thought this was such a great idea. And that's how, it was amazing that, who would have known that, starting out being a teacher in the ghetto of San Diego would end up being, well, it's kind of threat intelligence there too. Trust me, there's a lot of threats when you're a teacher in the ghetto. But moving all the way up to doing threat intelligence and working with corporations and letting them know that it's a bummer, but yes, China is after you. So that's how I got here. And the best part was I was at a party and I met Kelly, and she said, "Hey, do you want to talk at one of our meetings?" And I said, "Yeah." That's it.
Was that early in the party or a little later? You don't have to answer.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate sharing that and your observation about the career changes that a lot of the panelists shared, and how that's no doubt strengthened the perspectives that they're sharing with us today. No doubt that story is reflected in the audience here too, and it's something that we see in this health innovation space. The diversity of skill sets is so essential, and backgrounds is so essential to finding new solutions to complex problems. Thanks for highlighting that. So I'll throw this out to the panel. Before I do so, just a quick housekeeping note. We will have a Q&A when we wrap up, so we'll be running a mic around. This is being recorded, so we'll ask that you speak into the mic so the audio will pick up. Just throwing out to the panel, and this has been touched on, but I really would love to kind of drill down as best we can on this. This event is about bridging the gaps to the future behind us here. We have to speak to this at all times. Can you share an example of how you've seen clinical informatics bridge gaps in your career or your present organization? And if you can, at the center of all of this are people and patients. If you could try to put that into the example, if possible, and how do people show up as you're seeing these gaps bridged? Just throw that question out to whoever wants to start. Yuli.
So I have a team of full stack mobile developers in iOS and Android. And about I guess it's been almost 2 years now. About 2 years ago, one of our clinical informaticists actually approached us and said, hey, we had been part of a hackathon with Microsoft a few years back and started thinking about the space of post-op care and the fact that we really don't have good insights into what happens at home. When a patient leaves, what does the normal pain curve look like for a patient post-tonsillectomies? And, tonsillectomies and adenoidectomies happen pretty frequently. And so we thought it was an interesting concept. And he said, a couple of objectives. One would be to sort of educate patients and families on what to expect once they get home, because we get a ton of calls. And it would just be helpful to give them some of those insights so that they know what's normal, what's not normal. We also want to provide sort of standard post-op education. And then really what we would love is to get a sense of not what medications, but how many of their medications they're taking, because we prescribe them with a certain number of doses of oxycodone, but we don't actually know if they take them or not. We also would love to see what the pain curve looks like. We have a suspicion that it spikes at day 5 when the internal scab sort of falls off, but we don't know that. And so do you think you could build us an app? And so, we eagerly jumped into it, probably a little prematurely because we were a newer team. And what was really interesting is that it was really our informatics docs that led the charge. We had the backing of our chief of otolaryngology, Dr. Parikh, who's awesome. And he said, yeah, we're all in. We want to do this. But it was our informaticists who really asked the right questions. They were the ones that met with our pain team, told us which Wong-Baker scale to use, talked about the simplicity of how we wanted to capture some of the content, advised us on ensuring that we didn't create any medication confusion, but just captured dosing. They really advised us all the way through. And even as we had over 200 patients download the app and use it, they were the ones that took the data, worked with our data scientists to massage through it and better understand what insights we could glean from it. And what excited me about this project, there were millions of things that we could have done better, but what excited me was, one, patients at the center of their care, just the appreciation they had for, on a daily basis, being able to pull up a video of Dr. Parikh explaining what was a normal for that day post-op. And then 2, having some insights into that normal pain curve. And between the data scientists and our informaticists, they were able to graph that out, and they could definitely see some trends. They presented it in a poster at a research forum, and it also validated for us, we had actually decreased through some clinical standard work the number of doses of oxy that was being prescribed, separate from this app. But this app validated very quickly that the number of doses patients were taking were far less than what we were originally prescribing. So in light of the opioid crisis and otherwise, it gave us some quick insights. And again, kind of tagged on for us this belief that health happens where you live, eat, play, work, sleep. And this opportunity in leveraging mobile to be able to reach into those spaces and really understand what's happening is such a great opportunity. I'm sure you have stuff to say about that, but great opportunity. Yeah, and so that was one space that came to mind. I think, again, the thing I love about our informaticists who are heavily embedded in the clinical standard work is it gives us an opportunity at the point of care to begin to ask some of these questions and improve upon our care, change some of our protocols as we gather those insights. And I have a ton of other examples, but I'll hand it off.
Yeah, I'm going through the list in my head, trying to narrow it down. Again, having done this for a long time, some of the things that we thought were really innovative 10 or 12 years ago, now you would think is like, oh, that's so obvious. Of course you would do that. But part of it is to what you alluded to earlier, is moving from paper to electronic. There were just some pedestrian things that really moved the dot. One example is that database that I mentioned earlier, clinical outcomes database. By just looking at the data, we could see that we had a higher than expected mortality rate for GI bleed patients. And so we wanted to dive into that. I happened to be at an organization that was in a relatively well-known retirement community in Phoenix, Arizona. You might be able to figure that one out. But we had a lot of GI bleeders coming in, and we wanted to know why our mortality was the way it was. By the time we drilled through the data, what we realized is if the patient was admitted to the critical care unit, for every unit of blood that they received, they had a significantly higher probability of death. And one could say, well, that's obvious. They're a GI bleeder, and the more blood they need, the worse they're bleeding, therefore they would die. That wasn't really what played out in the data. When we really went through this process effectively of asking the 5 whys, well, why are they getting so many units of blood? Well, because they're bleeding. Well, why are they bleeding? Well, because they have these varices that are aggressive bleeding. Okay, so why are they bleeding 2 and 3 days post? What we realized is we did not have GI providers on call in our emergency department to provide definitive therapy in the emergency department. Because with varices, it's scope them, cauterize them, and send them on their way, because we're probably not going to address their alcohol consumption that's leading to the source of the GI bleeding. We didn't have physicians on call. So rather than it being a reaction to the blood transfusion, a number of things, it was a clinical care construct. We proved that if we could have an on-call physician on and cauterize them within a matter of a few hours, not only did the mortality rate drop, their length of stay drop drastically. So that's one from the old days. The other is we've had an opportunity to do a lot of work in the mobile space that I mentioned. A couple of really good products that we had the opportunity to be development partners with and research partners with. A great example is an app for asthmatic patients. And we started with clinical trials with this particular vendor. And when I left my organization, we're trying to deploy it as a standard of care across 40 hospitals. But proved that if we could get an app, Bluetooth sensor that goes on a rescue inhaler, get it in the hands of the patients from 5 years of age and up, if inhalers was their primary mode of treatment, that we could decrease ED visits by about 80%. And we decreased hospitalizations by 100% in a 500 patient population cohort in less than a year. And so what we were able to do was to monitor what they were doing when they were using their inhaler. The app triangulated with weather. They could put in their triggers as to what they were experiencing at the time. And through that, artificial intelligence began to predict when the patient was going to have an exacerbation. And so our clinical team could reach out to them proactively and say, we see you're hitting your inhaler a lot. And this is really true with adolescents. Those guys hit their inhalers and then they forget they hit their inhaler, and then they hit their inhaler and then they hit the ground. They compensate until they don't. And so we were able to predict those exacerbations and intervene. Frequently, we would just possibly changing their therapy, say, go ahead, go get your nebulizer, the other breathing treatment, the more intense breathing treatments, or come in. So we'll do some pulmonary hygiene in the clinic. So they were coming into the office instead of being referred to the emergency department. And working with our Dr. Merchant, our physician in this particular area, he had perfected it to the point that he was waiting for us to get our video visits deployed. He was bringing these patients in every 90 days to see them in the clinic. So he's an allergist, so he was dealing with the most severe of the asthmatics in this particular study. And he brought them in every 90 days just to lay eyes on them. And to your point, his goal was to manage them where they lived, where they played, where they worked. So we had then changed the treatment model to do a video visit every other visit. So you come into the clinic for this 90 days, the next 90 days I'm going to do a video visit for you at home. And what he had not anticipated by doing this approach, he knew it was going to help him manage the patient. He didn't realize it was actually going to change his treatment model for that patient population. And so it's the possibility to use something as simple as an app to fundamentally not only change how we deliver care, but the lived experience of those individual asthmatics. These are folks that aren't coming into the emergency department. Some of them 3 and 4 times a year, completely eliminated that. And needless to say, the total cost of care for these patients dramatically decreased. So outpaced what the development cost was for the intervention.
How powerful.
Okay, we have to connect afterwards. I'm pretty sure we implemented the same tool, and we'll have to swap notes.
I do have something to say about this, and it's not negative. So as a patient, and as, looking from a provider standpoint, I think the standards of care is so important. And, if you look at it, the more data that a doctor or a nurse can have, the better the standard of care. And it's very exciting for me to hear what you guys have to say, because my mind is running through all the different things or the possibilities. Of course, there's always the threats. I had to throw that in there, sorry. But it's amazing, because I look at this as, we do a lot of stuff in the major hospitals, but all of this stuff is easily pushed out to rural hospitals and for care also. So you guys are awesome. See, I was not Debbie Downer.
Thank you. And I'm going to go off script here a little bit and ask you another question. So I'm learning a lot here. I knew next to nothing about informatics until joining you all on stage. But I'm learning quite a bit, and I'm becoming quite inspired about this as maybe the future then, and the future is now with informatics, that we're not really bridging much any longer. That said, and you've shared powerful examples of the power of informatics to develop, or to deliver rather, for a patient-centered lens. What are some of the barriers? So it seems to me then scale is an issue here. What are some of those barriers to scale? We touched on institutional challenges, trying to sell it to the larger provider systems. I imagine that's one. Maybe you can speak to that more. But what are some of those barriers? Why are we having this meeting? Why aren't we out solving healthcare right now?
Yeah. I think the reality is it's hard. I mean, you can pull up any triple aim document and start to read a white paper on it and understand that the ecosystem of our healthcare system is not yet aligned, right? So our payment models are still where they are today. Institutions are not largely on value-based contracts, which means we're not largely accountable for your outcomes tied to the cost of your care, right? So that makes things difficult. I think when you're not a provider-payer system, you start to think about who the customer is. My husband recently actually had a situation where he was scheduled for emergent surgery, and then the surgeon said, "Oh, we have to postpone your surgery till Friday because the insurance company is in a dispute with the anesthesiology group at the hospital, so your anesthesiology won't be covered. And as a result, you can't have the emergent surgery that we scheduled tonight." And I thought, what? Like, I know that happens, but when it happens to you, you immediately start to go, wait a minute, I'm enraged, I'm gonna write a letter. But then you start to think, wait a minute, I'm weirdly not the customer. My husband was weirdly not the customer in that scenario. Who would need to write a letter? The surgeon wrote a letter, which, bless his heart, he's already busy enough. He's writing a letter on our behalf to the insurance company. And then I thought, wait a minute, who would write a letter? Is it his employer? Well, his employer is a small employer. So they're not an Amazon. They're not a 700,000 employee site. And would it even make a difference? And so it just speaks a little bit to our accountabilities. And I'm not pointing fingers at the insurance company. I think systemically we have issues, right? As far as our hospital is in the same scenario. And it becomes so interesting, even within our system, we have one primary care site at Seattle Children's. And so when we start to think about simple things around where's the right level of service for that GI kiddo who has constipation, well, you want that serviced at the PCP level to tell the patient, prune juice, take these meds, you don't need to see a GI specialist yet. But when you don't have when you are not the primary care specialist, does it make sense anymore, right? To begin to think about that whole vertical stack. And so when we talk about alignment issues, there are some deeply entrenched historical and present day issues that make it really hard to get on the same page, even around answering the simple question around who's the customer. So in this example of this asthma inhaler, this was the really positive side of the story. And our side of the story was really interesting, right? Because it became very clear that I'm trying to figure out how to say this the right way. We weren't ready, right? We weren't ready to absorb what we needed to absorb to change the model of care, to treat the patient at the right place at the right time, right, in the right way, to prevent the illness before it escalated. Even though that was the goal, we didn't have the right levers in place to make those changes rapidly enough. And so this question about system alignment and support and being able to find the right interventions and make sure you have the right people in the room to do that, I think, at least in that example, amounted to why it's so hard.
Well, you bring up a really good point. The incentives are misaligned. So in that particular case, as much as a great story that it decreased ED visits and hospitalizations, what does that mean for a hospital-centric organization? It means we made the conscious choice to turn our backs on the revenue because it was the right thing to do for the patients. Which just is, as a nurse, just is really hard for me to even compute that we would do it any other way. It's always about what's best for the patients. But as an organization, we took a really big, deep breath and said, this is the right thing to do. The other thing, when we were trying to roll this out, to your point about the barriers, we actually had to go through 6 months of hoops with CMS waivers in order to be able to provide this tool at no cost to our patient population. Mission-based organization, heavy Medicare and Medicaid, not a super expensive intervention, but really, retail price would be $800 to $900 per patient, and that's out of the reach of some of those patients. And so we got the clearances doing it as a pilot, as in a study, but when we said this is what we want to do enterprise-wide, and there's some compelling information around COPD, which maybe the Children's Hospital wouldn't be as interested in predicting exacerbations of COPD 3 and 4 days in advance. For those of you who've taken care of those patients, you know that's the difference between a ventilator and not ventilator in some of those more frail patients. We had to go through a lot of hoops to prove that we were not offering it as an inducement. And we were giving it to already established existing patients through an established patient care relationship, but because of the way the regulations are, we had to make sure that we were covered and work with legal. We knew we were still at risk, that potentially they could come and say, hey, this is an inducement. So we had all of our documentation in a row if that ever happened. So there's some misalignment. The other thing, kind of really putting my informatics lens on, is when I first got into this work, it was, oh, you're one of those computer nurses. No, I do not take care of the computer. We use a computer to take care of patients. But when I took my executive director position in Phoenix at the hospital after I stepped away from the corporate team for a while, I had the CNO say, I'm so glad you're here. I don't do computers. Go do what you do. Make sure we can use this thing. So part of my personal goal is we have to develop these capabilities at all levels of our organization. It's mandated within the credentialing organizations for nursing programs now that we teach informatics skills to bachelor's prepared nurses as they're coming out. Master's and advanced degrees absolutely have to have an informatics component because this is the use of data and information to drive care. I kind of liken it to, I was a med-surg oncology nurse for years. Yes, we had a med-surg oncology clinical nurse specialist, right? It was super talented person, but she didn't do all the med-surg oncology care in the organization. She was the specialist that helped us establish our standards, make sure we were meeting our standards. I see informaticians in the same role. We just happen to have that as our specialization, but all of us in healthcare have to have these skills, and that includes our executives, our CNOs, our CEOs. We put so much information in front of them on a daily basis, and we just assume they know how to consume it and make good decisions off of it. And I don't know that that's a fair assumption. So we spend a lot of one-on-one time coaching them on how to use these tools to drive care, how we tie these decisions to strategy. We shouldn't just be buying technology because that was the great sales pitch from our vendor that happened to come in. This has to tie to a business strategy and organizational objectives, or it's just the flavor of the month. It will go on a shelf and not be used. So I completely agree. It's a lack of alignment, and Moore's Law is a perfect example. We are advancing so rapidly in this space, but in healthcare, we are very conservative. We practice how we were trained, myself included. I mean, I still use basic tenets that I was taught in nursing school that I do believe are still relevant, but I practice how I was trained. And had I not continued to pursue education, get exposed to new ways of doing things, I'd still be practicing like I did in 1986. Many of our physicians are still practicing the way they did when they came out of school, and it's not a fault of theirs. It's that the structure is not set up for them to really stay current. I think the last statistic I saw is you have to read something like 120 journal articles a day to stay up with the information that's being generated in medicine to stay current. Well, that's not possible. So for me, it's about building those capabilities and those constructs within the healthcare system so that we can stay current, so we can leverage what we know. And then it's just-in-time access to information, not expecting them to have it all memorized the way we used to.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
So I have to now do the warnings. So the more data we put into electronic form and the more stuff we put on computers, the more opportunity it is to have, wait for it, ransomware. So you have all your systems and all your information, and you don't have those backup systems. You go back to paper, and you go back to paper fast, or you pay the ransomware. So there's that too. Again, the more information we put into electronics and in informatics, the more opportunities there are for the bad guys to do malicious and bad things. Like I was thinking, I was talking to Kelly and I said, you know, what type of things do you do? And she said, well, I do, different Kelly, I do compliance. And I said, well, tell me a bit about that. And it was, you know, they get an alert when something is supposed to happen at a patient. And I immediately thought, well, if it's prescribing some sort of drug and that person is a high-valued target to somebody, they could easily hack into the system, and instead of saying, you know, they need a dose every 24 hours, they could simply erase the 4. And then all of a sudden in healthcare, it's not about money, but now somebody's gone. So when we do all of this, the important thing is to make sure, as we're moving forward, to look at it from a security perspective, and I know you guys are, but look at it from a security perspective. Make sure that people are educated and aware of the security challenges. And like I said, with threat intelligence, it's like understanding that what's that famous saying? Just because you're paranoid doesn't mean people aren't out to get you. Because there are so many opportunities. And even as far as insider threat, which is a huge problem with healthcare, and insider threat, people may not even think they're being malicious, but they are. And a lot of people will just, you know, look into somebody's record because they're just curious and don't realize it's like, oh, I wasn't an insider threat. But that's huge also. So the education part, making sure that as you're building your systems, there is security in there. And especially because with threat intelligence, it's huge, again, with business decisions and making sure the executives are educated on all of it. So there you go. That's the message.
That's great guidance. Thank you. Thank you all for that. I have a couple more questions, but I'd love to turn it to the audience for any burning questions that you might have. I'd love to make sure we have enough time. Kelly is our mic runner. We have a hand raised. Oh, and another mic there. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ann Minks from Bellevue College, right across the pond over there. And I'm really glad to hear you say that we need to be educated from the top to the bottom. And I teach, I'm the program director for Allied Health, but I also teach in the healthcare management and leadership bachelor program. And my charge is to make sure that they understand the importance of not only learning the technology themselves, but imparting that importance to their staff. What advice might you give to students or faculty when we're in the process of teaching these folks before they go out on the job? Is there anything that you can think of that you might, that you wish you knew right out of training that you could help us with?
You know, I'm actually going to take that one first. The most important, I think, when you're talking to an executive, and I see this a lot in sales presentations also, don't use acronyms. Explain what everything is and then use the acronym. Make sure you're speaking English. And I don't mean that it's like, you know, speaking a different language, but sometimes when we go in and we talk to people and we're doing informatics or technology or something, we're assuming that they know everything that you know, and they may not. So put it in English terms and in business terms. And like I said, don't use the acronyms first. And now back to you, Kelly.
Oh, the things I wish I would have known when I graduated from nursing school. Specifically to this informatics space, I think my advice is tap into your community resources to help you do what you need to do. There are not enough faculty in the programs that have real world exposure and experience. And so you're finding yourself in the learning it in the textbook and then imparting it onto your students, hoping that you'll meet their needs. And that's got to feel a bit uncomfortable. So I strongly encourage you to do, partnerships with organizations, the hospitals in your area. Informaticians are educators. particularly the ones that are nurses, we're educators as much as we are anything else as part of our practice. My sister's the school teacher. I will tell you, I'm not a teacher, but more than happy to have conversations about what does this mean? What does it mean to your practice? It's a little bit like the math teacher who made you learn how to do the long equation before they let you use the calculator. It's very much that piece. We need to understand healthcare data, what it means, how do we use it. We need to know how to use the machines first and foremost. Then take it to the next level is what does this mean at scale? What does this mean for a population of patients? So I really encourage you to tap into your resources that are available. And I encourage all of you that are informaticians, if anybody calls you to come talk to a class or to sponsor a preceptor, please do, because it's so super, super hard. And I think trying to just stay current on what the trends are. You can tap into, there are wonderful, I don't know about Amazon, but there are wonderful tech companies that will come and do private-public partnerships, even if it's just for 1-hour presentations to give them information about artificial intelligence and machine learning and blockchain, I suppose. That would be my biggest advice. Don't try it and do it all yourself. You're just going to be up really, really late every night.
Too late.
Right already, yeah.
If I could just add that we are looking for advisory board members. That's always a challenge at an education institution. So if you're interested in being one of our advisory board members, please come see me. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, sir, in the front. We have a question up here. Kelly? No, mic here.
Hi, I'm David Miller with Health Catalyst. You mentioned, Kelly, something about the rate of innovation, and that's actually something that I'd be curious to get everyone's perspective on up front. How do you balance the risk versus the rate of innovation at a healthcare institution versus so many other places where the rate of innovation can move ahead and errors don't really matter that much?
Well, we do move at a snail's pace, and so I do have to say, I don't know that I'm going to be answering your question directly, but I will say there's a lot of hype out there. When I went to HIMSS in, I think it was 2017, you couldn't hit a booth without people throwing AI, ML. And I will say that AI, ML has gone through its hype cycle and is kind of coming out the other end. And it's really interesting what you're starting to see in that space. It's gotten very pragmatic. And you'll see that the use cases are vertically much more deep now. Interestingly enough, most of the use cases that are applied are in back-end systems and how to create a lot of efficiency. So at least in our space, what we've recognized is, one, be curious and ask all of the dumb questions. Because I've seen over and over again leaders across the board not bring the people who are closest to the work at the table, your innovators, your boots on the ground individuals who can ask the really pragmatic questions around how does this innovation actually result in outcomes today? And you can start to suss it out pretty quickly, right? When you ask the questions around what are the other leading healthcare institutions doing with machine learning in a pragmatic way that has demonstrated outcomes. So I think sometimes we can get wowed by all of the buzz, but at the end of the day, you know your book of business. And if you have clarity on what outcomes you're seeking to achieve, how you start to leverage the tactical technologies or opportunities becomes pretty clear. So I think that's how we've gone about it. I have a love-hate relationship with all the meetings we have with a lot of potential vendors because I think it can be very synergistic and very productive. But you want to look for the partners who are willing to come to the table and be really transparent about what's been proven and what really requires an investment of your institution's time and intellectual capital to result in an outcome. And typically those evolve over long-term relationships. And so setting that out at the outset, I think, is so essential.
Absolutely agree. There's a app or a tool or a gizmo for everything out there. And I have learned in healthcare, we may be slow to move and we have a severe case of attention deficit disorder. It is bouncing from one thing to the next to the next. And maybe it's part of the nature of the people that come into healthcare that we all would have been ADHD kids if we were, kids now. I think aligning to your point of understanding who you are, who you're served, and what your biggest priorities are. We had some great opportunities to partner with startup companies that had an idea that made sense in our gut, that aligned with what we wanted to do as a mission-based organization, and were willing to take the risk on whether it paid off or not. Some of them did. Some of them didn't. Some of them didn't pay off in monetary hard dollars, but paid off in brand, in mission, in some of those other areas. So I think you have to know what your true north is and stay true to that and not get distracted by everything that's out there. It's not to say the next vendor that comes along isn't going to have the great idea. I've had some pitches where same way, I'm like, oh, I have to talk to this person. And by the time you come out the other side, you're like, you know what? This may be interesting. I can give you one example where I rolled my eyes. I got handed the product saying, and you get to have it. You're now in patient digital care transformation. Therefore, you get this product. And it was a simple idea, which is SMS text messaging with the family members or the support system for an individual who's going through a surgical procedure, right? We've all got the whiteboard up on the wall that gives them the status, but they can enroll in this and get an update, whether they're at the hospital or not at the hospital. And I'm like, this is kind of lame, guys. I mean, it's SMS text messages. How exciting is this? It's probably one of the biggest improvements that we did as far as patient satisfaction, was just knowing if I wasn't there, I was going to get a text message to know how they were doing. Super simple idea, and literally a one-man innovation shop. He outsourced his engineering, and it was one guy. One of the biggest improvements in patient satisfaction scores of anything that we did. So stay open to the ideas, but stay focused on what's your true north. And for us, it was about the patient experience. And making sure they had the information and the tools that they needed to self-manage. That was really our focus in our digital space.
Fantastic. Great question. Anyone else?
Yeah. Oh, hello. This is Tom. I'm from Peer Consulting, and we've got a University Academic Medical Center. We've got a Pediatric Medical Center that share patients. So the question is, how do you share that information, and how do you minimize the threat of the data becoming public?
So we're both actually going through EHR conversion. So we have shared. We were both on EHR vendor A and shared our build and our configuration and tried to stay in alignment as much as we could. But we had the same challenges. Might as well have been Children's Hospital of LA as far as actually exchanging of information. We're moving to another vendor that I think for us is going to have a little bit better of a community sharing of information with patients. But we haven't solved it, and I don't think the industry's solved it. This whole interoperability, talk about hype, the whole interoperability space, we could do a whole 6-hour discussion on that. I'm a firm believer that the patient should be the integrator of their data, and the patient should say who their data is shared with. With some of our community connections and whatnot, there's some relatively free sharing of information, and I get a little nervous about that, because just because we share the patient doesn't mean we should share the patient's information. There's some choice and some right in that I'm a little nervous with. But for us, going forward, it will be through a shared EHR vendor and a shared information exchange that will allow us to do that work. I think the verdict's out on that. I'm a firm believer of HIE that I as a patient enroll in, and I say, yes, that organization can have this data. And I'm also the only one who knows everywhere I've been. I was a military kid, though I wasn't a true military brat where I traveled all over the world. But until I was 21, my records were within a military healthcare system, and I couldn't tell you the names of the doctors I saw, but I could tell you the location in the clinic. I'm the only one who knows that. And my mother. She's the only two people on the planet who know that. I'm the only one who can make those connections. So I think the verdict's still out on how we're going to do it. I'm a big fan of putting it in the hands of the patient.
I'm so glad you said that. I could not agree with you more. I think the industry is moving in that direction. How quickly it does and whether or not healthcare is at the center of it is yet to be determined. You look at things like Apple Health Kit, and for those iOS users, if you connect your LabCorp data to your phone, you immediately get it in along with the alerts. And you get it in real time at the same time that your physician gets it. And there's a whole cascading series of effects that occur around what does it really mean to enable patients as the stewards of their own data. I think we're seeing some upcoming legislation that's coming up, right? There's some language around open APIs. And more than ever, I think, as informaticists in the room, your engagement in some of the proposed language coming through is really essential because open APIs connotates EHR vendors do not get to charge in order to enable the freeing of the data. And once you start to free the data, then the marketplace begins to take that data and grapples with some of the things we've talked about here around human-centered design, viability, desirability, feasibility, and what do you now do with those increments of data to create actionable insights as an individual consumer? What can you now do with that information? And so I think the tidal wave has started, and as a healthcare entity, the question becomes, are we ready to respond? Because it's going to come a lot faster than we've ever seen. And I think informaticists are positioned so well right now to have their finger on the pulse of that and begin to affect change within institutions. I'm seeing it in my institution. I've seen Carol and Rod so craftily, right, have some of these really tough conversations about what does it mean to have open notes and whether or not you, the oncologist, are ready to have those labs resulted today and available to you. The industry at large is dictating a different response than maybe one that we would feel comfortable with. And so easing that transition and having those tough conversations is at least upon us today.
And it fundamentally changes the power dynamic. Like it or not, healthcare, it's, the care delivery team has been here and the patient has been here, and we dole out our wisdom when we believe you're ready to receive that wisdom. So it fundamentally changes the power dynamic when you put the data in the hands of the patient and they come in informed and asking questions. You change the timing of the information. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had with oncologists about how dare you release the pathology information to their patient portal. And the oncology nurse in me says, how dare you withhold that information? Because let me tell you what they fill that 72 hours with. They've planned their funeral. They've planned their daughter's wedding without them. They've filled it with all kinds of things that are probably worse than what the message is that you're going to deliver them. And for sure, if you're going to come back and say, you know what, your pathology is just fine, they've gone through an entire emotional roller coaster because we want to control when we release that information. Now, I'm not a fan of flinging things out there and creating hysteria either. There's a real change in the power dynamic, and it's a fundamental change in the provider-patient relationship. And that's something we have to grapple with. I think nurses have grappled with that for a long time. Our power relationship with our patients is a little bit different. But it's a challenge. I've been really encouraged with what I've seen with folks that are coming out of training programs now. They're starting to have these conversations. I think there's a time where the relationship is different. But for some of my colleagues that graduated from school about the same time I did, this is a difficult challenge. You add that to all the coding compliance things that we've put on them. We've completely changed the role of being a physician. It's not what they signed up for 35 years ago. And it's a reality. And so some of the things that they push back on are some of the things that we're questioning. It's way deeper than the thing that they're questioning. It's about this real shift in the power dynamic. I would also argue that as healthcare institutions, as companies come up with their own mechanism for providing care, be it Apple in Silicon Valley, who has their own patient clinic. If you saw the media this week, Amazon released Amazon Care, where these large corporations are saying the way we're going to solve the problem is we're going to become our own provider. I don't blame them, but it is a number of forces that are changing the power dynamic.
I'm going to actually say something too about that when you mentioned threat. So I think it's the responsibility of all of us to be secure. So as we have more data, we have more personal data coming from our healthcare. It's like we have to make sure that that data is secure. I mean, if it comes up and it says, "Do you want us to save your password?" Say no, and then write it down on your mouse pad. I'm just kidding. Just kidding. So I think it's important that I happen to love that, I'll get information about, whatever from the, my healthcare provider, because I'm one of those people that I want to know now. I mean, I live in hyperspace, so I want everything right now. But I also know that I need to be secure on my own computer, my own devices, that I'm not sending it out to somebody that I don't want to have it. So.
Great observations. Another question in the back. Yeah, Dan.
Yep. Excuse me. My name is Dan Ferguson. I run an outfit called the Allied Health Center of Excellence based in Yakima, but I work for all 34 community colleges. Ann's one of my clients, so to speak. So if each of you have taken different paths to get to this point, if you were encouraging a high school senior to get into this work, what would you say? And what would you say in terms of helping them look at whether or not they would be the right fit?
Run away.
I don't know that I can answer your question. That's a tough one. I have been on this little bit lately around following your curiosity, and I think whether you're at the beginning of your career or towards the end, it's so important that you continually follow that curiosity and start to unpack. I read something from Clay Christensen that said, where there are problems to fix, there's a way to innovate. And there was this little bit around, the death of innovation occurs with the 3 C's: conference rooms, conference calls, and I can't remember the last C, but I think curiosity is at the core. I can't even remember what your question is actually, but curiosity is at the core of sort of sussing out, is this the right fit for me? And also, I loved what you said about finding mentors and reaching out to your community. When I went back to school in health informatics, I had been through a first career, and you just find you're a little bit more bold. You're not wasting time, so it's like you're in the front of the class, you're asking your professors, like, who should I go meet? I was volunteering at the public health system to find out, like, did I want to get into informatics there? And until you go there, you don't know. And so as soon as I went to public health, and no offense to public health, but I knew, like, no, this was not going to work for me. And when I met the people that I was going to be working with at the 2 opportunities that I had, that was the other piece of advice that I had got when I said, I think I want to do privacy, but children's seems like the place I want to be. One of the professors said to me, look for mentorship more than the job, and advised me as such. And that has really stuck with me. Another one of the people I worked with a long time ago, he said to me, because I was closing doors thinking that I didn't want something, and he said, always put yourself in a position of choice, because how do you know? And so work as if the opportunity might be opened up to you, and follow your curiosity and step into it, because you'll know right away, and then listen to your gut. So I think for students who I've mentored in the past, who've met with me on a periodic basis, that's what I've advised them on. I've told them, be humble, be curious. When you look at these job descriptions, I remember when I was looking at job descriptions, I didn't know what half of the clinical documentation integrity phrases were. And I actually reached out to somebody at Evergreen and met with her and said, can you just explain to me what this job is, even though the job was at Seattle Children's? And she took the time to break it down for me, and it made such a difference to come prepared to that job interview for me to ask the question of myself, is that what I want to be doing? That job only lasted a month for me, by the way. And I thought, I'm gonna poke my eyeballs out. I cannot do this job. And thankfully, there was another job within the department that they asked me to apply for, and so it was fortuitous. But I will say I showed up to that job every day with curiosity and putting my best foot forward so that I could put myself in a position of choice. And that's what I would advise students. I think sometimes I mentor students today where they close doors without knowing what was behind it sometimes.
My first advice is listen to your mother. She probably knows as good as anyone where you should be headed. I came home in the 3rd grade and announced that I was going to be a nurse. My mother did not let me deviate from that path. My other option at 16 was to be a forest ranger, and the only school was somewhere in Wyoming, and when I found out it got to be about 60 below zero, I opted out on that career choice. But the other piece of advice that she gave me is, one, learn to type. And I said, I'm going to be a nurse, not a secretary. Why do I need to type? And as mothers always do, she said, yes, but you're going to need to type a resume. And I had no comeback for that. The fact that I learned to type is probably the only reason why I am in informatics, because if I would have had to learn keyboarding while doing all the rest of this, I would have spun right out. So not a problem now because they learn keyboarding. But the message in that is really understand what drives you. I was very passionate about helping other people. I watched every show my parents would let me watch. Yes, I had a crush on Joe Gannon. I'm gonna date myself here. Hot Lips Houlihan was my idol. Her and Dixie McCall. I so wanted to be on that patch phone in the ED. Never was an ED nurse. I just wanted to be on the patch phone once. But I knew what I was passionate about. It was the core of that was helping people help themselves. That was fundamentally the tenet of my essay that I wrote for nursing school. And I turned to my former chief digital officer when we were deep into some things about data, and I said, I finally am to the point where I really feel like I have the information and the access to the data to put it in the hands of patients to really help them help themselves. So my message is they need to really do some soul searching. They're not going to know the answer right, but they're going to know what's important to them. You know by the time you're about 16, 17 what makes you tick in your core if you're somewhat self-aware. Tap into that and leverage that, but to your point, remain open to the ideas. I was going to be the CNO. I was going to be Hot Lips Houlihan of some hospital somewhere. That was what I was going to be. And the closer I got to that, the more I realized I was getting farther and farther away from my passion, and the more I disliked it. And I had to make a conscious kind of pivot point to say what really makes me tick, and that's really when I pivoted to using data to drive clinical quality, because all of this is about making sure we get the right care to the right patients. And though taking care of one patient at a time is super rewarding, I wanted to be able to make a bigger difference. So I had to get into looking at populations and leveraging data and helping move organizations forward, which then got me into the EHR space, and which gets you into population health. At this point, we can touch people all across the country, and in our case, because of where we are in Seattle and the kind of organization, across the world with the work that we're doing. And part of the reason why we're able to do that is we have these technologies that connect them. The patient flies here from another country to have a unique service. I think Children's is the same way. We can continue to help take care of that patient when they go back home to whatever country it is that they came from. That's pretty powerful. So I would encourage them to really do some soul searching about who they are and the type of work that they want to do, not so much the title, and for sure, not the money. If I would have gotten into this because I wanted to make money, I would have changed jobs, because I made $9.20 an hour as a new BSN grad, and I thought I was in the money. Till I found out my physical therapy friends were making $20 an hour when they graduated from college. So if you're going to be in healthcare, if you're going to be in this space, you really have to be passionate. You really have to want to do this work, because it's hard work, and the money will come, but it's not going to be there straight out of the gate.
To underscore the last point of that, where you highlighted passion, and passion is something that we see in this space. Each innovator that comes in this space is deeply curious, and their curiosity we see leads to their passion or helps really embolden that passion. And one observation or one piece of guidance we offer to them that might be applicable, Dan, to your question, is that the entrepreneurs that are most successful use their life experience to elevate their product and tie their passion into the purpose of their product. So we highlight that and amplify that wherever we can. And one sort of neat note that struck me as the panelists were speaking is this observation from a professor at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, who looks for duct tape and sees duct tape as innovation opportunity, right? There's something broken about that product, duct tape solving a temporary fix. There's lots of duct tape in healthcare. So folks that are looking to innovate in this space can use their life experience as patients primarily to identify that duct tape and bring a solution to the space. Any other questions? Yes.
Jan Radoslavich. And the 2020 election is right around the corner. And the number one issue is healthcare, right? That comes up over and over again. And I've been really thinking about this. It's, healthcare insurance and access really is what they're talking about. But you hear Medicare for all who want it, / private insurance, or, keep the same broken system. Now, I realize, we're clinical informatics, it's not necessarily financial, but what can we do individually and collectively to contribute to the information and clarity needed by the voting population to understand this issue and maybe help them think through what the options are and be informed about what it is that they're voting about? Because believe me, there is not very much information and understanding about this topic out there.
Goodness, we're out of time, I think, before we can get into that. Thank you for that question. I mean, it's obviously so core to all of our work, and the next 14 months are going to be very much around that. Any observations? Do we want to?
Let me just start with, don't believe everything you read on the internet. And also, I was just recently at a meeting where they were showing fake videos. So just be aware of the information that you're getting and be more aware of, make sure you double check it. And that's my warning. And now back to you to actually answer the question. Ladies?
I think the only thing I can say is healthcare is a fundamental human right. And other than that, I don't know how deep I would like to dive in this. And you're right, it's very complex. Issues get mired into other issues, right? And so I think as we began to really interview our patients and families and hear their story about their journeys, we were privileged enough to be invited to someone's home where she sat us on her couch and said, "Oh, that's where my son actually had his cardiac arrest. That's where my husband performed CPR. That's where, this is where the EMT came. This was our journey." As you start to wander the floors and you see the families that look just like your family, and you start to recognize that it's really the luck of the draw, isn't it? Who is in that bed versus who isn't. Healthcare is a fundamental human right, and this is one of the only countries that has not recognized that yet. And so it's a very personal issue that I think I always encourage our team to get involved, to read the latest things that have come out, to respond, to, when it becomes open for you to make your comments on different things that come out, even through CMS, to engage. That's all I have.
Yeah, I would take that one step farther. Is every single one of us has to have an opportunity, even if it's just one interaction with one other person, to engage them in that conversation. So the Medicare for All is an interesting thing. I think it's a little bit of a misnomer. It's easy to say Medicare for All because from a political campaign perspective, because people know what Medicare is and they want to have it for everyone. What they're really trying to say is some sort of universal coverage, right? Be it a single payer or multi-payer or whatever. I think getting past the rhetoric and the buzzwords to what does this really mean? What does it mean for you as an individual? What does it mean to have choice, to not have choice? And educating them on the options. I grew up in one of those families where there's certain things you didn't talk about: finance, religion, and politics were three of them. I'll leave the fourth one off. You didn't talk about them in dignified public settings. So I didn't grow up with those conversations. And I think we're in a time now, if we can keep it civil, would be my first thing, regardless of what side of the coin you're on, to truly have deep conversations about what it means. And for me, it goes beyond just Medicare for all or healthcare coverage. It also gets to some of the more public health issues that we're faced with: opioid crisis, gun violence. I think part of our responsibility is to be part of the conversation, but not part of the discourse. If we can have civil, thoughtful, intelligent exchanges, hear both sides of the coin, because there's, as my mother-in-law would say, there's his side, her side, and the God's truth in the middle. And I think that's true of any of these things. There's probably truth on both sides of these issues, and we need to find something that's in the middle. But I do believe we need to be part of the conversation. If we did not listen to our emergency department physicians and the incidence of head injuries for pediatric patients on bicycles, we would not have ubiquitous bike helmets. If we did not listen to our emergency department folks talking about taking care of patients that would have otherwise survived had they not gone through the windshield, we wouldn't have seatbelts. If you really look at the history of some of our best safety policies that are out there, they come from very passionate healthcare clinicians who were willing to step out and have the conversation. So I just encourage us to have the civilized conversation.
Such a great question. Thank you, and a lot to be said on that. Unfortunately, we actually are out of time, and I'd love to talk with you after. We'll have a chance to network and hang out for a bit. We are out of time, and I want to start, before thanking the panel, on behalf of my colleagues and on behalf of the panel, I'd love to thank you. You guys are here. You are passionate health innovators, and HIMSS Washington, we are fortunate to have such a strong chapter here in this state. Cambia Grove does a lot of work across the country. We are fortunate to have a strong chapter here in Washington, and so happy to work with you all as often as you'll have us. Truly, we do our work because of people like you and this larger health innovation community. So I just want to, as a quick plug into what's next, we have so many great meetings and conversations, but oftentimes we don't really think about what's the next step, right? This doesn't happen in a vacuum. How do we keep this conversation going? How do we push innovation and push these conversations to actual solutions? So we heard about tomorrow's great event. I hope you can join us there. There's another great lineup of speakers that'll be in front of us tomorrow down at Bell Harbor. Cambia Grove, think of us as a continuation of this conversation in this space. We have a number of events you'll see on our chalkboard, and if you're not on our newsletter already, please sign up. We have a 5 Points of Healthcare conference coming up at the end of January, where we'll dive into the verticals that we touched on here. The policymaker will be a big one as we focus on 2020, no doubt. In June, we'll be talking about payments and incentives, right? We're talking, that's at the core of all of this work. So we'll be diving into that in another conference format. So we look forward to seeing you there as well. And as a HIMSS member, come to our events for free. Enter the code PARTNER at registration and join us. We are a non-revenue generating entity of Cambia Health Solutions, and truly here as an ecosystem supporter to the work that you all are doing. So thank you for coming, and thank you for all of your work. And please join me in thanking our wonderful panel for this conversation. Thank you, guys.